Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of The Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Isabella Sarto-Jackson. She is lecturer in cognitive science at the University of Vienna, guest lecturer in cognitive biology at the University of Bratislava, executive manager of the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, and president of the Austrian Neuroscience Association. And today we're focusing on her great book, The Making and Breaking of Minds, How Social Interactions Shape the Human Mind. So Dr. Sarto-Jackson, welcome to the show. It's an immense pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for having me. It's a great pleasure to share my insights with you and with hopefully everybody who's going to listen to this podcast.
Thank you. So, we have lots of ground to cover here because there are many things associated with how we approach the study of the human mind, human psychology. But let's start perhaps with DNA, because as I read in your book, that's also one of the places you primarily came from. And actually, I've already had many interviews with, for example, behavior geneticists on the show. And so, particularly about this sort of nature versus nurture debate and the focus that sometimes we have on DNA, or much of the time, indeed, we have on DNA, do genes really hold precise instructions to create a being with all its, in this particular case, psychological traits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Very important question, and this is something that, as you already said, I started as a geneticist. My master was in genetics, in yeast genetics, actually, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot. And actually, the beginning of my book is dealing exactly with that topic. So, one of the things that I would like to start with is that I have very strong doubts about this strict gene deterministic way, because it's very simplified. And it's especially unhelpful if we talk about the human brain or cognitive processes, because there we have so many causal factors that underlie the organism and the human mind. So this nature-nurture dichotomy is actually, to my mind, some sort of obfuscation, which has its historical roots in going back to the 17th century. It frames nature in this very simplistic way. We look at the DNA as if it holds the ultimate information. And on the other hand, you have this environment, which is completely separate from the organism. And as we know now, this is much more intertwined. So there is a dynamic interplay between genes and environment. And this interplay is mediated by the organism, actually, with its active involvement. So importantly, I would say there is like reciprocal interaction between organism and environment. And from that point of view, it doesn't make sense to artificially separate biological and environmental factors. Historically, that might have had benefits to study certain aspects, but I think it's time to overcome this dichotomy.
Mm-hmm. But just to be fair here, do you think that at least most behavior geneticists are really genetic determinists? Because at least with most people I talked with on the show, I guess that all of them acknowledge the role of the role of the environment. Of course, they talk about heritability, about twin studies. Some of them put a little bit more emphasis on genes, some of them a little bit more emphasis on the environment. It also depends on the traits we're talking about, right? But do you agree that perhaps at least most behavior geneticists do not tend to be genetic determinists? Mm-hmm. Neither. Right.
I definitely agree, because we've come a long way since, and of course, it was the geneticists who kind of disentangled a lot of factors and saw that there was a lot missing in the picture. However, historically, keep in mind that it was this behavioral geneticism was always seen like a one-way street. So you had the genes that were kind of in control. And on the other hand, you had environment separated. When we look at it, I think now, then we have to acknowledge that there are at least 3 contributing factors that shape behavior. We have the variability that's within the gene, in the genes, in the genome. Then we have a variability depending on environment, social environment, cultural environment. And then we have the variability in the phenotypic trait. And this, and here I fully agree, by now most acknowledge that phenotypic traits are polygenic and multifactorial. So maybe one more thing is that one has to be very careful when thinking about genes as the most important factors, that very often one also implies some sort of causality. And that is misleading, because to disentangle causality based on the genome versus the environment, that's quite a task that requires much more than just looking at the underlying genetic sequences.
And of course, throughout our conversation, we're going to get into each of the specific factors that play a role in our in the development of our psychology. I mean, it's genes, of course, but it's also gene expression. And apart from genetics, again, we have the environment, we have the social context, we have culture, we have, by the way, not just the brain, but also the rest of the body. I guess we're going to talk about that as well. But just before we move on to this idea that you explain in the book of thinking about genetic susceptibility instead of genetic determinism, just before we get into that, so what can we make of, for example, twin studies and adoption studies? Because, I mean, even though genes, of course, are not the entire picture here, they still play some role. So what do you think, what would you say is perhaps the useful information we can get from a twin and adoption studies?
Yeah, so again, in the light of the history of how these studies have been conceptualized and performed, they were really important in trying to disentangle nature versus nurture. Especially because most of the traditional studies like pedigree analysis or genealogical methods, they always assumed that there was a bimodal distribution of traits within the population. Now, with twin studies, it was easier to find a good or to have a good method at hand to appraise the hereditary environmental problem with respect to non-bimodal characteristics, at least in theory. However, again, here we have the problem that also twin studies are phenotypic correlation studies. So again, underlying causalities cannot be deducted from that. Maybe the other thing that also has to be kept in mind is that we have to also think about when doing these association studies is to make sure that we control for confounding factors. And although twin studies, of course, give a much better handle to study entanglement between, or to disentangle environment and biology, we should not forget that also in twins there can be a lot of underlying confounding factors, and they also have to be, they're very often neglected. I'm aware that this has come a long way, and of course it's a lot more, there is much more evidence now for what you can study and what points cannot be elucidated. So importantly, maybe just as a final sentence, is one of the most important recent outcomes from neurobiology is that even in twin studies, it has been shown that the anatomy of the brain varies relatively significantly. So there are some areas where it's perfect, where we have perfect correlation, but other areas where there's some significant variation, even between monozygotic twins that have exactly the same genome.
Mm-hmm. And that, of course, has to do, I would imagine, when it comes to, for example, neonates, with the fact that during brain development in the uterus, there are many stochastic events that play a role that we can't really entirely predict, and that are not predictable just by genes themselves. That's just one example, right? Then we also have levels of hormones and the ways by which perhaps neurons establish connections with one another that have to do with many different factors that are not entirely written in the genes neither. So there are many things like that that could lead even immediately after birth to two identical twins already having from the outset slightly different brains. And then, of course, as they grow older, as they have their unique life experiences, and we're going to get into that later, of course, their brains become even more dissimilar, but those are some of the factors that play a role there, right?
Exactly. So exactly what you're saying. So there is already quite a significant degree of randomness because the amount of genes that we have, even in considering all the splice variants and so on, they can never, so we're talking about maybe 22,000 genes, they can never program or give an exact blueprint of the connections of 86 billion neurons, let alone 10 to the power of 15 synaptic connections. So that would not be possible.
And so, I mean, what would genetic susceptibility mean here in this particular context? If we are rejecting the idea of genetic determinism, which I think most people nowadays reject, what would it mean to say that perhaps there's some genetic susceptibility to developing certain particular traits?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I just want to point out that although I use susceptibility myself very often, when it comes to development, I actually prefer thinking about potentiality, thinking about what is the underlying potential that the genes give us. So whereas susceptibility has always this negative connotation that is related to sensitivity, like being predisposed for a drug or to a disease or something.
I understand.
So what is the susceptibility? This is kind of a potential that is written in our genome that allows us to unfold certain traits. But this very much depends on stimuli from the outside, and that can be the ecological environment, the social environment. This can be factors that come even from the internal environment, like positional information, depending, which place within the organism certain cells have. So basically, as I see it, is we have a huge potential that's written in our genome, and whether it's realized or not depends on very many factors. And to be honest, there is many, many more information, let's say passive information, that is never realized because we just haven't got the environment for it. I like to call it, a colleague of mine used to call it, and I have taken that phrase because I like it so much. That's Darwin's hit the ink, it's written, but in a yet invisible way, and only being exposed to certain stimuli, to certain environmental factors, then the potential unfolds.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the environment itself, I mean, how easy or hard is it to study the impact of specific environmental factors on human psychology and development? I mean, because of course there's a myriad of things happening around us at the same time, and some of them might influence us, some others do not influence us. But I mean, how easy or hard is it for us to really be able to know what aspects of the environment have an impact on human psychology?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's a great question. And here I would like to draw a parallel to genome studies. Actually, okay. When genome studies were set out, originally, most of these studies were dedicated to investigate individual genes. Like I remember myself, I've been involved in projects where we knocked out individual genes in yeast strains. So, and then only with the advent of different, better methodologies and more encompassing techniques, mm-hmm. like then the genome-wide
association studies.
There, you got a different handle on looking on many factors or many genes at the same time. Now, mm-hmm. in parallel, when we now consider the environment, we're kind of almost at the beginning. I know, not quite, but there is much, so we're lagging behind. We only took now the environment into the consideration. However, a lot has already been done with studies coming from the exposome. So what's interesting there is you take a lot of different factors, external factors that might be global factors, or external factors that might be very specific, or internal factors. And all these factors together might give you a more complete picture if you combine that with genome-wide association studies. And moreover, and that must not be forgotten, you take all this information, all this data, but you have to also follow the developmental trajectory, because this is what makes the picture complete. So rather than taking a snapshot, look at the different stages of the ontogeny, and there you get a more complete picture. So we do have quite a few techniques in our hands that will help us, but I think we're still quite at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also this phenomenon of organism environment interactions, mm-hmm. right? It's not that even though if we are considering the environment and how it influences psychology, it's not that we are just passive receptors of environmental influences. I mean, there's also a sort of dynamic interplay between the organism and the environment, and we are like active agents also playing a role and to some extent shaping our own environment, right?
Actually, yeah, Ricardo, if I may, you've already said the most important things that to my mind is, so there is not only this reciprocal interaction, but it is the organism that influences its own environment to make it, the organism himself, herself, more adapted to its niche. And especially when we talk about humans and our cognitive capacities, we are the paradigmatic niche constructors. So we are able to change our environment that it kind of very well suits us. And that has been done for our entire evolutionary trajectory. And and it's getting faster and faster now. That might bring different problems, however. But this is something, so as you already said, so you've pointed out the most important points already. Yeah, so I think maybe one thing is when we take or we look at other species, for example, then you can see that the environment has a plethora of different effects. So think about temperature dependent sex determination in some organisms, or population density dependent sex determination in others, or predator induced polyphenism. So all these things that have very specific outcomes that are studied in other species. In humans, we've got so many factors that can influence us on top of our very long development, childhood and adolescence development. So all these selective forces that can shape us have a long, long time to take its effect.
And I mean, we were talking about genes just a minute ago, and even when it comes to genetic evolution, I mean, now we have a broader framework of gene culture coevolution, right? And it's not just genetic evolution itself occurring, but we also have culture, and culture itself might also influence how genetic evolution unfolds, and also the other way around. I mean, genetic evolution might also influence how our culture develops, or how attuned we are to certain aspects in our culture, or the kinds of culture that we have in comparison to, for example, other cultural animals and so on. So there's also this sort of interplay between genes and the cultural environment, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there is, of course, some classic examples of that, what you've just mentioned, like when our ancestors starting to keep animals and used their milk. So we had this shift in our ancestors had this shift in lactose tolerance. In humans, so we have so many cultural processes that speed up or maybe even take over evolutionary natural selection, biological evolutionary processes. And a colleague or colleagues of mine have recently shown that because of medical interventions like performing cesarean sections, the evolutionary pressure that is forced the human skull of a newborn to remain relatively small because it had to fit through the birth channel. This pressure has been relieved now because of our medical interventions. Yeah. So we really, with our cultural evolutionary processes, we speed up selection processes.
And by the way, I would like to get into this notion of neuroplasticity, because I mean, there was a period, I guess, that back in the early 2000s where we really had a very big hype surrounding neuroplasticity, and at a certain point it seemed that it was going to explain everything out there. But I mean, now we have perhaps to tune it down a little bit, and I would like to ask you, so neuroplasticity, what is really the role it plays in the brain, in brain development, and what are its limits?
Okay. Yeah, so neuroplasticity, this is a very exciting topic. So we have, actually the concept is more than 100 years old. Santiago Ramón y Cajal was probably the first one, or was the first one who described it. But then he kind of, because it was not well accepted by his colleagues, so he kind of reduced it to the assumption that it only happens very, very early, and then the brain is no longer malleable. However, what we know now is that there is a huge flexibility and neuroplasticity, so a functional and a structural neuroplasticity, especially in the human brain. But what is this plasticity? Actually, this is like a reorganization that helps our brains to adjust themselves within an organism's lifespan, and that helps to adjust or to adapt to the environmental experiences. Now, looking at it from an evo-devo, so evolutionary developmental perspective, it's actually, neuroplasticity is just kind of an exploratory mechanism. Like we have similar forms in other organisms. So what does this mean? So you have mechanisms that perform environmental sampling, and so they sample the environment and get reinforced when a certain aspect of the phenotype is has a positive receives a positive stimulus, so a positive feedback. So So as I said, this is actually an evo-devo concept. And in the brain, you can see it, and it has been studied very thoroughly, because it's so obvious that we have this high abundance of neuronal connections, so the synaptic connections in the first, so when we spot, I'm sticking now with humans, in the first 2 years of age. So we have this excess of synapses. And then what happens then is you get pruning that depends on the external stimuli. So whereas the exuberant growth of the synaptic connections, this is largely genetically driven and also randomly fostered. But then what is actually stabilized, which of the synapses remain and which get lost or are eliminated, very much depends on environmental stimuli coming from the social and the physical environment, cultural environment as well. So you have this use it or lose it principle. Yeah. So we have some peaks, I said, childhood. There is another one in adolescence that's more of a recent finding. So we have two really large peaks of rearrangement in the brain. Now, this is a huge potential again. There is cases, I've written about some of them in my book, cases where the brain really completely reorganizes itself. For example, cases of hemispherectomies where half of the brain, so one hemisphere, has been surgically removed because of a severe illness. And this person almost fully recovered. So could walk again, could speak again, even made a college degree. So the functional half of the brain took over the function of the missing half of the brain. So it's a huge potential. However, and here I agree with you, there has been a huge hype and not everything has been fulfilled, what was hoped for. So there are limitations. And what are the limitations? First of all, it's age. This is probably the biggest thing. So the younger you are, the more malleable the brain is, of course. Second thing has also to do with the brain region we're talking about. So what is some regions, you can see that in where, for example, there is a lot of neurogenesis going on, hippocampal areas or dentate gyrus, olfactory bulb, maybe also in the cerebellum. There you have a high capacity of neuroplasticity. Whereas in other regions, and we see that in patients that suffer from strokes, other regions might be much more difficult that there is some new cortical mapping going on. So that's another thing. What else? Things like neurotoxicity. So if you do damage to your own brain, for example, by alcohol, or your mother did by drinking alcohol while you were a fetus. So again, you kind of interfere. Another really fascinating thing what has been shown is that stress level, the amount of cortisol interferes or is antagonistic to neuroplasticity. And last but not least, of course, all sorts of neurodegenerative diseases are kind of that inhibit or interfere with neuroplasticity. I'm sure there's many more other limits, but these are now on the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. So in the history of neuroscience, there have been two very dominant ideas. One of them perhaps is more recent, is more from, I guess, the 70s, 80s, somewhere like that. But I mean, the first one is localizationism. That is the idea that there would be a one-to-one mapping of brain areas and particular functional traits, including character traits, that I think is the ones that we are mostly interested in here, because we are talking about human psychology and people's traits and so on. I mean, and then the other one is modularity of mind/brain, and perhaps to some extent they might be, I guess we could say, a little bit related, because if we can find that certain functions are exclusive to certain particular brain areas, then the idea of modularity is just saying that, okay, so we have different modules across the brain that have evolved separately to serve certain functions. Perhaps the main argument here would be to serve certain evolved functions related to survival, reproduction, and so on. I mean, how do you look at these ideas? Do you think that they are still very dominant in neuroscience? Is there still some support to them, or not so much?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly interesting, because first of all, let me be a little bit provocative, because my argument is that the localizationist view is actually rooted in the legacy of phrenology. I don't know if you can see.
Yes, I was actually already noticing it.
So of course, this is just provocative, and we've come a long ways since. So this thinking of that you have different areas that are distinct, or different traits can be mapped to very distinct brain areas, mm-hmm. And that even goes for character trait, personality traits. So this is something that is, to my mind, largely overblown. However, when we look at the gross anatomy of the brain, then the localizationist view is not wrong, right? Because I mean, we know from studies that individual case studies, like that there is a relatively high reliability, not 100%, never, but some areas that so otherwise these whole brain maps, the brain atlas that's now has been established by the huge flagship EU project wouldn't make sense. So there is, to a good degree, there is localization, especially when we talk about the motor cortex or somatosensoric cortex and so on, like defined by Wilder-Penfield. So there is, I'm not disputing that. However, an extreme localizationist view of functions is almost certainly wrong, because this would go completely against neuroplasticity, and actually including Wilder-Penfield already like more than, I don't know, 70 years ago, he already saw that there are some overlapping zones, and this is not like a clear-cut module. Now, and another thing that would also kind of argue against it, not only the neuroplastic argument I've just brought and which we touched upon previously, also you can have brain damage in different patients at the same position, and they have very different symptoms. So also that would argue against it. Now, what makes the real big difference is, of course, the microanatomy, how the synaptic connections are then established, as we've already seen in terms of this use it or lose it. Now, in answer to your question, how does it relate to brain modules? Well, one thing that comes to my mind is that in case of evolutionary psychology and this view of very clear-cut brain modules, then there's always this debate that a lot of it is innate, if not all. So you develop, of course, you're not born with it, you develop it, but you develop it, that comes due to some input from the environment, but it's still always, the module will be roughly at the same time. Or, however, there is also a different interpretation coming from the sparseness concept. It might not even be anatomically exactly at the same position, but yet you have like a sparse network that always kind of gives you a module. Mm-hmm. Now, this is much more difficult to disprove. What I can, to my mind, from what I see coming from the neurosciences is that, yes, there is modularity. Yes, gross anatomy is relatively reliable. You can do these brain maps. However, this massive modularity hypothesis that with these highly specialized models like a Swiss Army knife, mm-hmm. that is, to my mind, has the most neuroscientists have moved away from that. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Also, one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you about that, actually, and you mentioned evolutionary psychology there, and yes, massive modularity of the human mind is a big idea in evolutionary psychology, specifically, not exclusively, I guess, but yeah, specifically there. But since we talked about genes at the beginning of our conversation, sometimes it seems to me that not just the modularity of mind idea, but also some of these localizationist thinking has some parallels with gene-centric views of psychology in a way that, I mean, sometimes you hear evolutionary psychologists, for example, claim that the neonate brain sort of harbors innate cognitive modules that come equipped with contents that are specified in the genetic makeup. I mean, something along those lines, right? And so we would have, I think that the correct term here would be information processing mechanisms that are innate and that are, again, specified in the genetic makeup and that are associated with these or that different kind of brain or mind module. So I guess that this is the idea. But basically what I'm asking you here is if you agree that this sort of modularity, localizationist idea sometimes links to gene-centric views of human psychology.
Definitely, I very much appreciate this point that you highlight that. Actually, I see it in a very similar light. So there is this kind of idea of innateness that has a little bit of a touch of pre-formationism. So that you have already, all the information is already there and you just need to unfold it, but it is already there. And I think, the truth is always probably somewhere in the middle. It's not completely wrong, of course. Mm-hmm. There is good evidence also for some of these claims. However, as I see it is, you have these predispositions coming from genes, and they give some kind of a kickstart. They give you a guiding expression, and then it is the development. So or let me say it like this: that you have a predisposition, and that provides then a substrate for the developmental processes to operate. So, and I think this is where it comes from. It is not completely wrong, but and I agree on the parallel which you pointed out. So I think, yes, this innateness concept smacks very much of pre-formationism.
Yeah, and I don't know if you agree with this point specifically, but I guess that you use the word predisposition there instead of thinking about in terms of innateness, I guess. And I would imagine that, there's, I think, good evidence that perhaps we are born with some predispositions to, for example, pay attention to certain information in our environment, particularly the social environment. For example, I don't know, look at people's faces and try to gather information from them, and perhaps some aspects of language might also be predispositional and stuff like that. But then perhaps the idea that's wrong here is to think that those predispositions are like fixed, and the underlying information processing mechanisms cannot be changed at all, or are impermeable to culture and to all kinds of environmental inputs. Does this ring true or?
Yeah, that definitely. So you touched upon a really, really important point here, because what's completely left out in the whole debate about modularity is the concept or the idea of acceptation. And especially the human mind, with all our cultural evolution, we have a lot of what our brain does, what the human mind does, falls in the domain of acceptation. So what is that? So we have certain brain regions maybe that have evolved for some specific adaptive purposes, but then they have been repurposed, hijacked. You mentioned the example of attentionally focusing, visually focusing on, I think, social stimuli and so on. Now, obviously, our visual senses are very good. Now, our culture has evolved to that we use writing, and we're able to read and write. So we most certainly don't have an innate module for learning to read. So this is an acceptation. So this was most likely a region that has been adapted to pattern recognition, pattern completion, and that has then been used for different purpose, for reading. Yeah, and that doesn't sit well with evolutionary, with the massive modularity hypothesis, definitely.
And so one topic that I would like to get into now is, of course, when it comes to human psychology, at least in our modern societies, we also have a medical approach to it. And we use terms like normal development, normal psychology. We use terms like mental disorder, mental condition, and a mental disease, and something and stuff like that. So do you think, I mean, when it comes to thinking about what normal might mean in the context of developmental psychology, what do you think are perhaps some of the issues with that, with thinking that there's a normal way for human psychology to develop, and if a person, for example, somewhat deviates from that normal pathway, then there must be something wrong with them?
Yeah, this is again a very, very important question and topic you're pointing out. So to my mind, and I've written about it, this idea of normal has its roots in mechanistic thinking. So we see, and that again goes back, I always kind of see a little bit of the historical components here, that goes back even to René Descartes, and who saw the body as like the mindless machine, you know. And in this view, we have a view, we have a conception of a healthy body like a machine that runs error-free. This is not only a huge simplification, let alone that, but it has also other consequences. First of all, it assumes that there is something that is fixable. There must be a standard, a way how it should work, an optimal way how it should work. And if we fix that, just, you know, turn on this screw or change this little button, then we can all of a sudden put the person back into being normal again, establishing normalcy. That has a lot to do also with how the current psychopharmacology, pharmacology in general, looks at the brain. You know, that there's something out of balance, you change something, you turn some wheel, and all of a sudden you're in balance again. So this has problematic consequences. It also has societal consequences. We might want to speak about that. Yeah. And last but not least is it makes us really overconfident, because we can capture the complexity of a machine. So we might think, oh yeah, we might be able, you know, the heart pumps blood like a normal pump, so we must be able to fix that. And we completely neglect these multi-scale properties and systemic properties, which might, you know, have even, and I'm touching on a very hot topic here, which might not be true, but we might even be talking about bottom-up and top-down causations. So all these things which you will never find in a machine.
So, I mean, about this medical context and how we think about psychopathology, there are many things we could talk about here. I mean, just when it comes to simple classification and the DSM, for example, in 2022, I had an entire interview with Dr. Alan Horwitz, and we got into the huge mess that is the history of the DSM and how the classification of mental disorders changed drastically over the decades for reasons that have sometimes very little to do with science. So that's already a problem in and of itself. But I would like to ask you about the specific, very interesting thing that I read about in your book, that is looping effects. And I'm going to quote you here. This is basically how the verbal discourse about certain psychopathological or psychological phenomena impacts on how this very phenomenon is framed, theorized, experienced, and treated. So, I mean, it seems that also the way we theorize and classify disorders and study them itself might have an effect on how we think about them, and then reinforce, I guess to some extent, their own existence.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep. So yeah, you summarized it very nicely. The concept actually comes from Ian Hacking, and this is, I think it's important because it is a way of looking at pathologies, especially psychopathologies, in a way that may be able to bridge the normative and the naturalist conceptions. So what's at stake here? So if this is true, if these looping effects exist, and we classify, or doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists classify people in a certain way, then people may conform to the way how this pathology is described. So it opens up a space that they can express symptoms in a socially accepted way. And at the same time, it has this kind of component that it might lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, because this is the way how you expect to behave, or the symptoms you expect to express. So yeah, this is I found it interesting in relation to studies how children, when they were maltreated, again over history, what happened. It gives it almost absolves the parents from their responsibilities when you look at a pathology, and then you will say, yeah, but can't do anything about it, and this is how the child is like this, and the child then will act out in this way. So Ian Hacking actually used, I think, ADHD as a modern day, a contemporary example of the looping effect. So, you know, and interestingly, that might be very much depending on cultural inputs. What do you expect from how a person behaves? And another example is, of course, hysteria that disappeared from the DSM, for example. So yeah, I think this looping effect has a lot of potential to explain why some of the pathologies come and go, and why some of these pathologies express symptoms, or patients with these pathologies express certain symptoms at a certain given time in history, and then they don't anymore. So it has something to do with the social acceptance.
And also there are very particular examples, some of their very unfortunate historical examples, like the case of homosexuality, right? Which in not very long ago, it was considered a mental disorder. And I mean, with scientific progress and with people who were themselves homosexual expressing their own views and social movements and all of that, I mean, it has been fortunately normalized across many societies, not everywhere, unfortunately, but across many societies, and it's no longer considered a medical condition. But I mean, that's I guess a very clear example of something that was medicalized, considered an anomaly, just on cultural, normative, and moral grounds, basically because people, to put it in the simplest terms possible, didn't like that kind of behavior,
Exactly. So this is here you pointed out this is there was this very, very strong normative component to it, and there is always a walk on the tightrope about to pathologize symptoms versus to help people. So obviously you want to help people, but in some cases there is no help required, as in case of homosexuality. This was a purely normative decision, and here you pathologize a normal variation within the human population.
Yeah. And so, I mean, at a certain point there, you also mentioned when we were talking about how we think about normalcy, the fact that nowadays it seems that we are like biologizing, I mean, relying too much on the biological aspect of things when thinking about certain disorders. I mean, trying to find specific genes, specific brain regions that might be malfunctioning and that would explain, I don't know, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and all of that. But I mean, shouldn't we have moved already past this simple biological or reductionist way of looking at things? I mean, don't we have at this time already a biopsychosocial model of human psychology, and also, I guess, adding to that an individual's own history to consider?
Yeah, I see your point. However, what is extremely tempting about this, and I also think it's largely reductionist, but it does not necessarily have to be reductionist if you stay looking just at the biological parameters. But the exciting and interesting thing about doing that and focusing on the biological parameters is that they are quantifiable, they are measurable. And this is something that conveys objectivity. This is much easier to sell, to work with, than our messy environments where you take other theories that draw from seemingly soft sciences, that have qualitative approaches and so on. So this is where we still, in some cases, rely on Christopher Bose's biostatistical theory, although, especially with psychopathologies, there is hardly any objective parameter that we can specify in terms of what is normal in a given population versus where is a deviation that leads to these and those symptoms or pathologies. So I think that the appeal is simply because it's measurable and we have techniques that can be exploited for that. Yeah.
So do you think that when it comes to understanding how psychological traits work, how they develop through time, that perhaps a framework like dynamical systems theory would apply here and would be perhaps more closer to the reality of human psychology than some other, let's say, reductionist views out there, like trying to biologize or reduce everything to simple biological factors like genes, hormones, neurotransmitters, brain networks, and stuff like that?
Yep, that's a very good point. And again, I agree. So I think we're thinking along similar lines. So, we don't have a strong controversy yet. So I do agree. I think actually it would be very helpful to shift towards complex system theory, because with all the reductionist approaches, we're completely setting aside the relations among these different complexes and components in the complex, and disregard sort of systemic qualities. And yeah, so this is a really important point. However, these are, you know, you harvest usually the low-hanging fruits first. Yeah. So I think we're getting there. The field is moving, but there is still funding is still, there is still a lot of funding and still a lot of money in using the more traditional approaches, and some of them still may have merits. Yeah, but I think the next big leap or step has to be to look at the organism from a systemic point of view. I agree.
And of course, I guess that in this case, this is not at all to say that things like genes or hormones or neurotransmitters do not matter at all. I mean, they certainly play their role. It's just the fact that perhaps we have to think about our psychology as more of a dynamic system, and traits as not really fixed things that change and fluctuate over time in this or that direction. And the same, I guess, would apply to mental disorders, right?
Yeah, I agree. And just going back to something I said earlier, with respect to the exposome, when we look at genome-wide association studies related to the exposome studies, then it would be really important to look at all the developmental components that are involved and the whole trajectory of the development. So, as you rightly said, it's not, it's not fixed, but Konrad Waddington called it homeostasis. So rather than having the concept of just homeostasis with a set point where you return, where the organism goes back to a set point, it is the trajectory that is followed, not an individual set point.
Konrad Waddington is the one also related to the idea of the epigenetic landscape.
Right? Absolutely right.
Yeah. And so another thing that perhaps nowadays upsets many people, but I guess that we should also mention this, when it comes to environment and social relations, isn't it also important to consider here things like socioeconomic structures, systemic discrimination based on gender, race, or any other kind of social category, and other sorts of social categories, identities, and related factors?
Yep, very, very good point. So talking about socioeconomic structures, I think there has already been quite some good work done. And there is animal model studies, but also correlation studies in humans, where it has been shown that I think Michael Meany, for example, did something in this direction, and other colleagues also looked at what's the effect of growing up in poverty. And it has been shown that the level of some components of the stress axis or stress response axis, like cortisol and like ACTH, they are increased very early already in you could see a difference already in children of the age of 6 years, and by the age of 10 years they have the level of cortisol has already doubled. So I mean, this is really significant. Of course, we might discuss whether this is just reductionist, but this, in any case, is a good indicator. Now, the other points you mentioned, of course, they are very important, like looking at systemic discrimination. We know that stress due to hierarchy in other animals can be measured by means of cortisol level, for example. Discrimination due to gender, race, or other social categories probably will give the same result. I haven't looked into that, but I think we're here at the beginning of some big societal questions. And I think this scientific journey will eventually take us exactly in this direction.
Mm-hmm. No, actually, that bit about hierarchy and cortisol levels, it reminded me of studies that Dr. Robert Sapolsky did with baboons in baboon societies, where apparently the lower-ranking baboons had higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of stress, and that affected their physiology in many different ways. And then he talks about an episode where, I don't know exactly why, but for some reason the higher ranking baboons were wiped out, and then suddenly the cortisol levels for the others went down and the society was more peaceful, at least for a while. So yeah, I guess that's an example of that. Right.
And if you think of what cortisol does, not only to your organs, to your somatic organs, but also to your brain, that it interferes, I already said that, right? It interferes with neuroplasticity. It seemingly has an effect on the size of the hippocampus. Regina Sullivan's lab showed that stress components, when elevated, had an effect on the maturation of the amygdala, so of the fear center. So this is a bit of a pop science term, but you know, that the activation of the amygdala sets in earlier, which has an effect on what type of learning happens. So a shift from preferential to aversion learning. So this has immense consequences just by looking at a factor like socioeconomic status.
So going back to what normal means and the implications it has for how we think about traits, disorders, and so on, how should we think about normal then? I mean, because I guess that if we are being realistic here, I mean, there will always be norms in human societies, right? And there are things that we will always consider normal or abnormal. But from a scientific perspective, do you think that we should still think about normal in any meaningful way or not?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So maybe let me answer this from a more practical point of view.
Okay.
So there is this idea of normalcy is kind of dictated or established by the reference group that that is like the bigger part of the society. That does not even have to be, but say this. If we follow a biostatistical approach in the sense of Christopher Buss, so we have this reference group, and this reference group kind of defines normalcy. This is the current situation. Now, what also happens if we connect it back to what we've discussed earlier about niche construction, it will also be this kind of dominant group within the population that shape the niche. This is the group that determine what sort of environment we will all be living in. Now, in some cases, it has been shown that when there is a variation in traits, like maybe in high functional autistic people, like in high functional Asperger people, that they have immensely contributed to society, to success of, say, the virtual environment and so on. This is because they could pick their niche that seemingly fitted them and what they seemingly were well adapted to. Ideally, it would be these people who are neurodivergent, so not neurotypical, but you know, that could contribute in saying or in shaping the niche, because they are they would be better adapted then, and it would be much better for them to function and to contribute to society. I know this is a huge challenge, and in some cases with severe psychopathologies, it might never work. But yeah, so this is one of the answers in practical terms. Mm-hmm. The other answer, and coming a little bit more from the conceptual side now, is so defining what's normal has got, I already said that, this normative as well as this naturalistic component. Now, if we want to combine these two, then this means that we will have to have a real different way of looking at variability, at genetic variability, at behavioral variability. And I'm not sure where our society stands there at the moment.
It's actually very interesting that you mention neurodivergent people, for example, people on the autism spectrum, because I was actually going to ask you what were your thoughts on the neurodiversity movement. So if I understand it correctly, you look at it mostly positively, right?
Yes, I do. In general, I do, because I think it is important that we provide people with a niche where they can flourish, where they're nurtured, where they can develop their potential. At the same time, and here I maybe I've heard a little bit of a criticism from you, and here, but if I heard a criticism, I do also agree. We have to be also careful that that we do not kind of we will have to accept that some symptoms are quite debilitating, so they are very severe. And just
actually, I mean, if there was some sort of criticism in the way I expressed my question, it was exactly about that point, because there are, I think, good small criticisms of the neurodiversity movement, and perhaps they apply mostly to just a few people and not most people of the movement, where there's a risk of trivializing people that really suffer severely from certain, for example, extreme forms of autism and other conditions like that. Right.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so this is where we would have to be careful as a society, not to trivialize it. Yeah, but in general, I think we, as a society, we have to be much more open to variability, because this actually might open up completely new niches which we were not even aware of. So again, it's about potential.
Right. So I would like to get now into trauma and stress, but we've already talked a little bit about stress, mostly traumatic experiences then. But before we get into what actually counts as a traumatic experience, I mean, are there some aspects of how our memory and emotions work that you think would be most relevant for people to understand, that would apply to traumatic or to how we understand traumatic experiences?
So can I just rephrase it? So you want, sure. Or the question is how emotions connect to memory? Is this or is it?
Yeah, because I mean, I guess that perhaps when we're talking about traumatic experiences and trying to understand how they work and so on, two very important aspects of our psychology that play a role here are memory and emotion, right? Yeah. And basically what I was asking you, of course, this is I guess a very broad question, but what would you think are perhaps some of the aspects of how our memory works and how emotion connects to memory that then allow for us to have an understanding of what a traumatic experience is?
Okay.
That's my question.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so so there is, of course, a plethora of evidence that emotions strongly influence memory, especially episodic memory. Why is that? Because that's has a lot to do with emotions and how they change our perception per se, because we emotions increase our awareness, our attention to focus on specific details. Think of accidents or something where all of a sudden our sensory threshold gets lowered and we remember very, very minute details about, you know, crashing glass, or about it looks like or it feels like the accident took much longer, like a minute, and it in reality was only less than a second probably. And this is because our sensory threshold has been decreased and we are perceiving many more details, smells, sounds, tactile information. So this is well known. Now this is evolutionary important because emotions are kind of a label that inform us, or that kind of strengthen synaptic connections to tell us this is an important memory. You should not forget that. Emotions also help us, that they guide us through the environment and give or facilitate the quick detection of something that's relevant for our for us, like any sort of stimuli, like maybe a friend or foe or food or whatever might be relevant. Now, related to why is it that in traumatic experiences we remember things so, or what happens in traumatic experiences on the emotional level. So there is a few things to unpack here. On one hand, so one thing I've already said is that it lowers the threshold for sensory perception. And stress itself has stress helps us to process these stimuli very fast, because it takes the unconscious route via amygdala, via the hypothalamus and the amygdala, and it does not need to go into the cognitive, more aware route, or the conscious route, and gives us a very quick perception of something that might be a threat to us. And this unconscious change in our physiology can persist if the stress level, like an acute stress level, like in the case of developmental trauma, complex trauma, you know, if there is a prolonged stress level, then this prolonged stress level, this prolonged stress level will have an effect on how we detect stimuli in the future. So in my book, I write at some point as it changes the stress axis, and it actually changes the whole physiology. That means children who have been exposed to these type of traumata very often live in a relabeled world. That means they are in a constant state of alert, where their sympathetic nervous system, so the autonomic nervous system, is always in a flight or fight response. Mm-hmm. So that's something. The other thing that also is very typical for survivors of traumata is that they have very often intrusive hypermnemic memories. So memories that feel as if they are experienced now in the present with very strong details. And that is again related to what I said earlier about these lowering of the sensory threshold and remembering many of the details. Yeah. And then there is some of the opposite things which I haven't mentioned now, but just let me say a few words about that, is that in some cases, when there is the stress level is extremely high, people completely forget because they cannot integrate or the memory cannot be integrated in the existing network of memories. So it's almost as if they forget. But this happens especially with very young children before the explicit memory is fully formed.
And this also applies to, for example, contexts of unpredictability and helplessness, like for example, low social status, poverty, lack of social support, and contexts like that.
Exactly, because especially the last thing I said about if you don't even have an active, explicit memory about the incident, but you're still suffering from a change in your in your stress axis or in the components of your stress axis, then this gives you a different way of reacting to stimuli. For a long time, it has been believed that we must find high cortisol levels. But paradoxically, more recently, it has been shown that people suffering from severe long-term stress, they adapt their organism to this extremely high stress level by changing their stress axis, and they actually have relatively low cortisol. But this happens on the expense of like an allostatic load. That means whenever they experience something that is a little bit, for us would be a neutral stimulus, but for them is a little bit exciting or something, then their stress reaction, stress response completely exceeds a normal response. So this is so these people who are trauma survivors, especially for long term, they have really significant change in their neurophysiology.
And so related to that, there's this common idea that adversities make children grow stronger. But is that really the case? I mean, is there good enough evidence to support that idea?
Well, this is a really important thing, because you can then use that to draw policies. And this is kind of the standard view that you very often read in management books and so on. But these management books are addressed to, people that live in relatively stable environments that don't come from traumatic experiences. So on one hand, I want to cite, again, you have already mentioned him today, Robert Sapolsky. On the other hand, I want to say a few things about my own work working with psychotherapists. So Robert Sapolsky, he already pointed out that he already pointed out that if you have a high level of stress, then being pushed towards more uncertainty, this kind of learning zone, and go out and try to new things. Yeah, this actually triggers a whole different stress response than it would trigger in other people. And from my own experience, I have seen that in when working with psychotherapists, that even very neutral stimuli trigger a whole plethora of reactions that you could not imagine, that you would not see in a setting with other kids, for example. And that really makes me rethink that this has to be communicated more widely to policymakers, to people who are working with kids. So you don't push them out to learn something new, to get out of the comfort zone. This has to be done very, very carefully, because we're just dealing with highly vulnerable kids or grown-ups. Yeah. So this stays long into adulthood, maybe your whole life.
Yeah, and later we're going to get into resilience and how people develop it and what it means exactly. But just before that, I would like to ask you a little bit about attachment theory, because it seems that the people we develop relationships with in early life, and whoever they might be, and we're going to talk about that, those relationships seem to be very important. And then I also want to ask you, of course, if the attachment style one develops in childhood and so on is fixed or not. We're going to get into that. But I mean, what role do you think that attachment theory plays in this context of trying to, in the broader context of developmental psychology?
Well, first of all, I think as humans, we are a hypersocial species. So attachment is not only something that is evolutionary put down in our biology. So we're actively, we need, because we're the species that is born relatively early, as compared to other primates, with a relatively very immature brain, where there is a lot still to develop. That means we're helpless. We need the support of caregivers. And of course, attachment theory, this goes back to John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth in the 1950s. Yeah. So there has been a lot of amendments made to this theory, but the key principles or the key messages still remain true. So we need caregivers, otherwise we could not develop. If we are severely neglected, if there is nobody looking after us as a child, this triggers an immense stress in us. Children cannot regulate stress by themselves. They can upregulate the cortisol levels, but what they cannot regulate, they cannot down-regulate yet by themselves. So they need to be down-regulated. Stress needs to be down-regulated from the caregiver externally. So, body contact, oxytocin. Oxytocin is a wonderful antagonist to cortisol. So this is what all this attachment is for, because we need, in order to survive, a newborn and an infant needs connection to a caregiver. Now, this is something that was very controversial about 70 years ago, maybe even 60, 50 years ago. I think everybody accepts that now. So this is no longer controversial. However, what you already mentioned is that this is a developmental process. And the question is this fixed, or what happens in adulthood? And basically, this is not so easy to answer. First of all, it is a developmental process, and it also is split in different phases. So we have like an early prophase, we have then this preference learning phase, then we have this aversion learning phase that goes along with neuroanatomical changes. So aversion learning, for example, sets in when the maturation of the amygdala happens. So about the age of 7 to 8 months in humans, in chimpanzees, about 4 months and so on. So you can see, but then there is a partner correcting phase at the age of 3 years or something, when children start to begin to develop the theory of mind. And then what you said is, we have an attachment style. This is something how we observed it, we experienced it. This is how we expect that people act in a partnership with us. However, if you have a lot of positive experience with secondary caregivers, secondary attachment persons, and that can even be your teacher or your, coach, sports coach or whatever. Even then, there is a good potential that you, at least with some attachment styles, maybe not with the disorganized, but with the other two attachment styles, that you can balance out and you can improve and get a secure attachment in a partnership later on in life.
Okay, so I have two kinds of questions here. First of all, when it comes to the primary caregiver or caregivers, does it really matter who they are? I mean, does it necessarily need to be the mother or the father or even someone from the broader family? Or can it be really anyone as long as we develop a secure kind of attachment to them?
You actually really pinpointed towards one of the weaknesses of the original, of the traditional attachment theory as formulated by Bowlby, because he basically just looked at the dyadic bond between mother and child.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, back then, perhaps we didn't have enough anthropology to know that we are cooperative breeders, and he was starting from a point of evolutionary theory, right? He was very influenced by evolutionary theory, and back then we thought mostly about females as the primary and perhaps only caregivers, right? So just to be fair.
Yeah, you're right. However, and here I have to contradict a little bit from his own biography.
Okay.
John Bowlby should have known that it's not necessarily the mother, because his attachment figure, and that was actually the reason why he started to venture into this field, his primary attachment figure was actually his child carer called, I think, Minnie. So the first 4 years of his life, he was coming from a rich family, so it was not the mother actually being the caregiver looking after him. It was actually an alloparent, somebody else who took this role. Now, what you said is absolutely correct. So does it need to be the mother? At that point, we did not have, there was not enough knowledge from anthropology studies. Even he kind of, Bowlby also excluded fathers, but now we know that father can be as good as an attachment figure as mother in terms of stress regulation, in terms of bonding, even oxytocin release has been shown, measured by fathers, or not just fathers, but by a male caregiver. Let me just be neutral there. Yeah. Now, as you said already, so what about now with the new information we have from anthropology studies? So actually, interestingly, there is some populations, which is still hunter-gatherers, and there it has been shown that the very young children have many primary caregivers up to, I don't know, 18 or something. And these all can function as with them, they also develop very strong attachment bonds. And interestingly, these children also show much lower stranger anxieties at this, age of 7 to 8 months. So yeah, it doesn't have to be the mother. It has to be somebody who provides safety, nurturing, stress relief, regulation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the second kind of question I had here was, okay, so it's basically a two-part question. So the first part is, just to make this point clear, attachment styles later on in life apply to basically any kind of social relationship, right? To friendships, to romantic relationships, and so on, or not?
Basically, yes, but the closer the friendship and usually partnership,
okay.
The more relevant it is. So with just normal distant friends or at work, you can adjust very well. But the closer it gets emotionally, because you have this so-called inner working model that kind of triggers your emotional model that you've learned in childhood. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to that bit we mentioned about attachment styles potentially changing across the lifespan, I mean, it just came to my mind. I don't know if there's any specific research on this, but it just came to my mind if we should also perhaps think about attachment styles as we did back when we talked about dynamical systems theory and other psychological traits. I mean, could it be the case that, I don't know, in particular periods of our life, because we might experience, I don't know, particular kinds of friendships or romantic relationships, even if we grew up being securely attached, then we might become circumstantially more anxiously attached, more avoidant, or the opposite?
Yep. So the opposite, becoming more securely attached because of positive input from relationships as adults, that has been relatively well documented. Also the opposite, I have seen, and I have very interesting, as I very recently was part in a session with a therapist where this was really interesting to see also, to go a little bit away from the ivory tower and from the theoretical research and look into how it displays out in real life, and where you could really follow and monitor what happened there. So yes, also if you have experienced a secure attachment style, and you've developed in a model of a secure attachment style because of safe, and your needs were well met, emotional needs were well met in childhood, but then growing up, especially in adolescence, where you have a very strong reorganization of your neuroplastic reorganization of your brain, then you again if you're there exposed to severe disappointments, actually this can cause a change in the attachment style. Yeah, that not, of course, not to your primary caregivers, but then to how you interact with other partners. Yeah. Or
actually, that last point that you mentioned there, is it possible for us to have different kinds of attachment styles with different people that treat us differently?
That is interesting. That is interesting, and that was by no means covered in the original attachment theory. However, there is more evidence pointing in this direction. Yes, and this is especially fostered if you grew up in a family when you had several siblings, because there you developed kind of different kind of models, dyadic models. different people. So yes, but it's also true because you can have different attachment style to your father and to your mother. So even there you can also have it. And so yeah. This is more recent study as far as I know, but very interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I would like to go through resilience now, and then after resilience, I have just one last general question to ask you. But what is resilience then? What does it mean, psychologically speaking, to be a resilient person? And how do we develop resilience, since we've already talked about attachment styles, for example, and living in unpredictable and helpless environments and the effects that has on our psychology? So how do we develop resilience?
Very good. Yeah. Actually, probably the most important question. And in my book, I unfortunately really only dedicate the last bit to it, because that was not the main focus. But I think this is something that needs to be developed much more. So what is resilience? Resilience is in the face of adversities. You can overcome these negative experiences, and you can still grow. Actually, it's even more than that. You cannot only overcome, but you get even stronger. So, and this research has originally started by Amy Werner, and she looked at children at the Hawaiian island of Kauai, and many of these children grew up in really severe poverty, and a lot of these children later in life, in their teenage years and later in life, then had destructive or self-destructive behavior and ended up being alcoholics or committing suicide or having very unstable partnerships and so on. However, really surprising, within the same population, under very, very similar, if not the same circumstances, about a third of these children did not develop these destructive behaviors. So they were kind of resilient. They developed, they succeeded in life, they flourished. They actually, despite all these adversaries, they grew stronger, and they were on top of their lives. Now, what she found out, and that has been confirmed by many other studies, is these children who did not go into this self-destructive or destructive pathway were those who had at least one person who cared for them. And it did not even have to be the primary caregiver like the mother or the father. It was, in some cases, it was a teacher or something. And this caring person kind of counterbalanced then all these adversaries, including missing parental bonds and alcoholism and drugs and poverty and so on. So that was, I think, kind of, this is what was when this resilience research was born. And now, obviously, this is a really powerful message, because that means that at least one caring person per child should help a child to develop into an adult that can master his or her life. Now, in some cases, this is not easily possible. The caregivers are missing. So you asked me, so what are the factors, or how can we contribute to making children more resilient? And here I draw from insights that come actually from a few insights, but amongst others, that come from the so-called Circle of Courage that was developed by the indigenous population of Northern America. Mm-hmm. They showed that some of the the important key factors that they need, or elements that they need to support children to grow and to develop healthily, that are actually that are going across cultures. So that holds true for all cultures. And the first thing you need is to establish a secure, safe environment. So this, before you do any other interventions, the first thing is the child has to be safe. Take him, her out of the unsafe environment, provide an environment where he or she feels safe. And then the other 4 points come from the circle of courage. And the first one is establish an emotional bond. So make sure that there is a sense of belonging. This is the first one. The second one is, they call it mastery. Put some challenge, but only those challenges that can realistically be mastered by the child, you know. So I think Lev Vygotsky would call this the zone of proximal development. Help the child, but make sure it's possible for the child to master it. So offering learning, increasingly complex tasks for learning. So that's the second one. The third one, shift the power to the learner. So provide him or her with agency, self-actualization. Give the fate into his or her hand. And the last thing is, and this is something that I feel that society is missing more and more of it, is that build a relationship of reciprocity. That means altruism, that means empathy. Make sure that the child understands that for whatever he or she gives, he or she gets things in return in a very positive way. So these are kind of the 4 points of the circle of courage and the safety part. So this is kind of what I think are the most important takeaway messages from how to build resilience.
Okay, so one more question about resilience then, because you were talking mostly, if I understood it correctly, mostly about children there. Mm-hmm. But what if the person is already an adult and they have gone through an entire childhood and life of trauma? Do you think that perhaps there might be cases where, unfortunately, it's already too late to help those people?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would never, ever say it's too late, because I think nobody deserves that. Everybody needs people who believe in them and who support them. Mm-hmm. However, I have investigated, looked, and also from practical examples which I've seen, there are some cases which would require an immense effort, and very often people do not believe anymore that this is possible. So, and then you have the first step is not even initiated, because if you are already working with a client, or if a grown-up thinks that there is no chance for him or her for happiness, for partnership or something, because of severe traumata experienced. And in my book, I give a few historical examples. One from the Canadian children, the Duplessis children who grew up in these orphanages in Canada. If you don't give yourself a chance, then I think it's difficult, because in the end, it must come from your own willingness to become resilient, to flourish, to shape your future.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you, just to wrap up the interview, a final question about a broad topic of your book that is actually something that you introduce the book with, and I think that we've already at least several times mentioned or referenced it indirectly during our conversation. But when it comes to the study of human psychology specifically, what do you think it's important for people to keep in mind about how science works and how it is done? Because of course we've talked here about several different paradigms and disciplines. We've talked about behavior genetics, developmental psychology, neuroscience, and particular kinds of paradigms like dynamical systems theory and its counterparts. So what do you think would be important for people to keep in mind when they are working through the lens of a particular paradigm in science that perhaps might be bounded, that is usually bounded by particular axioms, methodological presuppositions, techniques, concepts, and so on?
Well, first of all, let me just pick up on something you already said, is I think when we talk about studying the human minds, then this is such a complex task that this requires anyway an interdisciplinary endeavor. So there is no chance that any discipline has the privilege over another discipline to elucidate the more important mechanisms or more important processes. So I really think, and that needs to be fostered, that there is a collaboration between scholars from the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. So, and that also should sink into the brains of the natural scientists. I said it on purpose. Now, to your question about what do we have to keep in mind when we talk about how does science work as such? So one of the things, and here I speak from the point of view of a natural scientist. So as a researcher, you always want to be really objective. You want to avoid, you said it, looking through the lens of some paradigms. You want to avoid that you're affected by some, I don't know, spurious cases, anecdotal evidences, or you want to avoid to become overly attached to a certain theory because this is something you have found, or because then you will be less open to critique, to disprove, to counterfactuals. Now, since I've been here at the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, we're a highly interdisciplinary institution where natural scientists, people from the humanities, especially philosophers and historians of science, work together. And the longer I've been here, the more I've discussed with people, the more obvious it is to me that true objectivity in science is really a naive idea. Yeah. So you already pointed that out. So this is, our research is always somehow bounded by some axioms. And it is kind of rooted very often also in a certain zeitgeist. So we're following what's popular at the moment. Now, I think we agree here. Science here is neither is not totally exact, not always correct, certainly. It's not objective, it's not unbiased. Yeah? This is very surprising to a layperson, maybe even surprising to young researchers, young scientists. Yeah, we have this really idealistic idea. Yeah, so I think the two of us agree on that. Now, as also most scientists will probably agree to that. However, I think they will not admit that very openly. Although they know that the research is based on who is doing actually the experiment, which methodology is used, which instruments are used. Now, but if I don't admit to that, then this is maybe a self-defense mechanism, because then you do not further kind of challenge, or you do not ignite further distrust of the public in science, because we want the public to trust us. But for my part, I see that in a really different way. I think one of the most important endeavors of a researcher is to grapple exactly with these issues, to look at the reality of scientific constructs, to see what is this demarcation, what is science and what is pseudoscience, for example. What are the problems with inductive inferences? Yeah, can I how can I establish whether there are some systematic bias in my research that may distort then the research processes? So I think all these things have to be addressed. They must be addressed, otherwise we end up running into the problem that we're no longer trustworthy. And after all, I think science is always, or doing research is always a process of the best approximation, where we very often take wrong tracks along the way, and very only occasionally we have a few breakthroughs. So I think we really need to continuously challenge our own views, and we have to question our pet hypothesis, although we might have grown fond of it. And this would be the only way how to make genuine advancements towards an understanding how the human mind works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by the way, if I may, and if you disagree with something I'm about to say, please tell me. But if I may add, I just wanted to say that I guess we have to keep in mind that science is a human institution. It's done by humans. The scientific method or methods themselves are ever evolving, because as we develop new techniques, as we discover new theoretical developments and so on, the way science is done now is not the way it was done 100 years ago, and 100 years from now it will be completely different for sure. And also, I guess that there's a very simple idea, or at least you can put it in simple terms, but it's more complex than it seems, that many people who are science communicators are always telling people about, that is that there's no definitive truth in science. Truth is ever evolving, but sometimes, curiously enough, scientists and people who are interested in science, like myself, I mean, sometimes we are tempted to treat certain discoveries in science like dogmas, and curiously enough, there are debates sometimes between scientists and religious people, and they are always telling the religious person, oh, you shouldn't trust what the Bible says because that's dogma, that's just a book, and so on and so forth. Then when it comes to some of their own pet hypotheses, theories, and so on, interestingly, it seems that they are treating them like dogma, like the religious people do, which is also interesting, because that makes us closer perhaps to certain pseudo-scientists or anti-scientists than we would like to admit, at least in certain cases, because we are all human anyways. But I mean, I guess that's what I would like to add to what you said.
I fully agree. Seconded.
Okay, so Dr. Sarto-Jackson, the book again is The Making and Breaking of Minds, How Social Interactions Shape the Human Mind. I'm, of course, leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And would you like just to tell people before we go where they can find you on the internet?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. It was a real pleasure. So I really enjoyed exchanging with you, because I think we very much think along the similar lines. So great, and I'm also a fan of your podcasts, and so I've already looked at many of them. So I might have to watch myself as well. I'm not sure if I want to do that. So how do you find me? You find me on the website of the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, the KLI. I have a Twitter account as Jackson Sato is my Twitter handle. You find me on LinkedIn, and I'm very happy if you get in contact with me via email, and that is my name, Isabella Sarto Jackson at kli.acat. Thank you very much.
Okay, so look, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. I loved the book, and I loved even more our conversation today. It's been an immense pleasure, and I just hope to have you again on the show somewhere in the future to talk about other topics. This has been a really fun interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care. All the best.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Costa, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Van Egdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.